Taoist story about a Chinese farmer who owned a horse. And one day the horse ran away. And all of the neighbors said, "Oh, how unfortunate. That's terrible. The horse ran away." And the farmer said, "Good news, bad news, who's to say?" Well, the next day, the horse came back, and it came back with 7 wild horses. And then the neighbors said, "Oh, what good fortune! This is wonderful news." And the farmer said, "Good news, bad news, who's to say?" And the next day, the farmer's son was trying to tame one of the wild horses, and it threw him and he broke his leg. And all the neighbors came and said, "Oh, what bad fortune. That's terrible." But the farmer said, "Good news, bad news, who's to say?" Well, the next day, the army came around enlisting young men to go off to war, and the son was not enlisted because he had a broken leg. And all of the neighbors said, "Oh, what good fortune." And the farmer said, "Good news, bad news, who's to say?" That story tells us that often when we're looking at something, we really don't know what is good or what is bad. We really don't have a sense of how things are going to turn out. And so if we prematurely call it one thing, we could really be off the mark. In the grand scheme of things aren't really good or bad. They just are. They just are. And it's best if we don't get too upset or too attached, because even if it seems dark and even if it seems like things are really bad, it can turn out to be just a wonderful opportunity. And everyone's saying, "Oh, this is so terrible," or "Oh, this is so great." Just because they're saying that, it doesn't make it true. The story seemed appropriate for today because the title, the that I'm talking about is open-mindedness. And we're in the first week after an election. And there are many people who are saying, "Oh, how unfortunate, how terrible." And there are many people saying, "Oh, what good fortune, how wonderful." And I wonder if we could just say, it is. It is. Good news, bad news, hard to say. Can we be open-mindedness enough to say that? See, we've gotten so polarized in our society, and each side really thinks that it's the most loving, the most caring, the most thoughtful for our country, for the humanity. Every the and what we learn is that the ego always wants to say it's on the high moral ground, that it's the one that believes rightly, that it's the one that cares the most. But Rohr tells us we see that the ego is still in charge, and it just wears different disguises on both the left and on the right side of most groups and most issues. The ego's still in charge. And each side kind of staunchly standing on their own interpretation of what the higher ground is and how to get there. See, this is a very common human thing. And in the book, The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership, which we went through earlier, they say that the common belief is I commit to being right and to seeing this situation as something happening to me. I commit to being defensive, especially when I'm certain that I am right. That's how the ego thinks. So if that's what's going through your mind, don't feel like you've been singled out or don't take it too personally. That's just what the ego does. But in the book, the authors say there's a commitment that we can take on that will help with that closed-minded stance, and it is being committed to learning through curiosity. Through curiosity. Instead of being so darn sure, have some curiosity. Instead of saying, how can they think that? Think, how can they think that? Curiosity. See, what if both sides are right and both sides are not right? My guess is that's probably the way it is. But see, we can think about a political thing that we stand on, or that we're aware of, some kind of ideology, like maybe we're saying, well, the Democrats are standing on democracy. Or alternative, we could be saying the Republicans are standing on democracy. See, we can have one of those beliefs or the other, but switch it around in your mind so that you're saying the other one is standing on democracy. Now, how does that feel? Is there something in you screaming, oh no, that's not the way it is at all? See, could we allow curiosity to say, I wonder if maybe at least part of that is true? That's a question we might ask if we were open-minded. See, the problem is not that all of those other people are wrong. The problem is in our perception that all of those other people are wrong. And perception, that's the arena of the ego or the protected personality. So before we go bashing the ego, I just want to say it has a purpose, and it's a good purpose. Its purpose is to facilitate what our soulful self, our essential self, what it has for us to do, what it has for us to bring up. The ego's job is to facilitate that, moving through life in that way. But see, the ego just got it a little bit wrong. It started thinking that it was the one driving the bus. And then that slides into, and so it was the one that was right. See, all of that's based out of fear. The ego's biggest fear is that it won't survive. So it can't be wrong, right? If it's wrong, then it may not survive. So it makes itself right about everything. And then it makes up stories to confirm what it thinks it's right is actually right. Yeah. And then it closes its mind to anything that's not that story. And there we sit. Herbert Spencer said, there is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all arguments, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt prior to investigation. See, that's a closed mind, and it can keep us in ignorance. The ego, it has to see itself as right. It has to justify that. And it makes up these stories. There was a man in India who who painted a tiger on one of the walls inside his home. And he painted it in such a lifelike manner that over time, he became afraid to even walk into his house. See, I think a lot of us are kind of doing that these days. We're creating something, we're creating a story, and then and we go into it so much that we think that it's real and make it more and more real, and before you know it, it's scared us half to death. But it's just a story. It's just a story. Moore tells us that the ego hates more than anything else in the world changing. It does not want to change, even when the present situation isn't working. He says, we would rather be ruined than changed. Wow, that's deep, isn't it? See, one of the dangers of being so attached to our beliefs is that we create an identity around this particular belief, and then the more we believe it and the more we have the stories to back it up, the more entrenched we get in that belief and in that identity, and we build up our ego even stronger in that way. And the ego defines itself by these attachments and by what it attaches or by what it pushes away, its revulsions. But the soul does not attach, nor does it hate. It desires and loves and lets go. So I think that this morning, probably all of us want to be on that path of the soul rather than the ego. What do? We have to have an open mind. It has to be open. We have to at least admit the possibility that what we think might not be right all the time, or some of the time, or even most of the time, maybe. See, Richard Rohr says, the calculating mind sees everything through the lens of its own private needs and its own hurts and angers. And it is too small a lens to see truthfully or wisely or deeply. It's too small of a lens. We're not seeing the whole picture. Now, most people do not see things as they are. Most people see things as they are. So if we want to have an open mind, we need to see things differently, not change the landscape of what we're looking at, but look with new eyes. Those who are in recovery are familiar with this. The book Alcoholics Anonymous, it says, some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go. Absolutely. Let go, absolutely. We need to accept that what we think may not be right. So one way that what this calls for is for us to disidentify with our thoughts. Instead of having our identity stuck in these thoughts, to disidentify with them. Steve Taylor in The Leap talks about meditation is this process of disidentifying with the thoughts, and that this identity shift helps us realize that our true identity isn't the ego self that does the thinking first, but the deeper, more authentic part of us that observes the thinking self. And that the more and more we become that observer, the more and more of a connectedness we feel with life and with others and within ourselves. And Rohr tells us all mature spirituality, in one sense or another, is about letting go and unlearning. The spiritual life has much more to do with subtraction than it does with addition. letting go of those thoughts we think. So disidentifying with that and then looking at things from a new perspective. In recovery, that's one thing that is required while you're working the steps. Is it says disregard what you thought about this in the first place, that other people were wrong. Okay, disregard that entirely and look at your own stuff. Look at your own stuff. It's a pretty it's a pretty big task to do, and it usually takes help from other people because we don't see our own stuff too easily. We're much more easily uh, geared towards pointing out the blame or someone else being wrong. It takes a big shift. Now, everybody doesn't have to go through that process of the 12 steps. Um, but this is a common thing in humanity itself. In the book, The 15 Commandments of Conscious Leadership, there's another belief that they bring up that is this: I commit to believing my stories and the meaning that I give them as the truth. Sounds like a tiger on a wall. And their antidote to this is exploring the opposite. I commit to seeing that the opposite of my story is as true as or truer than my original story. I recognize that I interpret the world around me and give my stories meaning. Wow, this really gets us to a place of letting go, of surrender, of admitting we may not know the truth, and that the opposite of what we believe may actually be more true, even. Are we ready to do that? It's a pretty tall order, isn't it? Well, I brought some tools with me today to help. And the acronym of the day is ASK, A-S-K. The A stands for ask questions. Ask questions. And for this section, I was drawn to pull up the work of Byron Katie. Now, she calls it the work because it's work. It's a wonderful way of self-examination. And and in it, there are four questions that you ask yourself, and then there's a what's called a turnaround after that. But the questions are this: anytime you have an issue where you're unsettled, something doesn't feel right, or you're thinking someone else is to blame, or they're wrong, um, here are the questions to ask. First, is it true? Now, most of us will say, well, of course I'm true. Of course it's true. But the second question is, can you absolutely know it's true? Absolutely know. Now, in today's society, I would say just because you heard it on the news or on Facebook doesn't mean it's true, okay? Can you absolutely know it's true? Just because a lot of people believe that way doesn't mean it's true. Can you absolutely know? The third question is, how do you react? What happens when you believe that thought? What happens? Does your heart start pounding a little bit? Do you feel maybe nauseated physically? Do you feel something like that, or do your emotions kind of get in a wad? Feel a little bit angry or upset or sad? What happens when you believe the thought? Just notice. And then the fourth question is, who would you be without that thought? Wow. When I get to that fourth question, it's like I feel like taking a breath because all of a sudden I feel more expansive. I feel like there's more that I can allow. Who would I be without the thought? It feels like there's more of an elevation of consciousness in that. So those are the four questions. And then after that, she says, turn the thought around. Is the opposite as true as or truer than the original thought? So, if, for instance, you believe that the Democrats are standing on democracy, turn that around to the Republicans are standing on democracy. Or if you believe the Republicans are standing on democracy, turn that around to the Democrats are standing on democracy. You can turn it around another way and say the Democrats are not standing on democracy or the Republicans are not standing on democracy. There are various ways you can turn it around, but it's a turning it around to look at the other side, to have an open mind, to be able to contemplate. Could it be true? The opposite of what I believe? Could there be some truth in it? So, A, ask questions of yourself. The S in ask, our acronym for the day, stands for switch software. And we're talking about the software of the brain, going from that calculating mind to what's called the contemplative mind. Richard Rohr tells us this. He says, let me tell you something very important. The word prayer is a code word for an entirely different way of processing life. When you pray, you move from an egocentric perspective to a soul-centric perspective. I call the first perspective the calculating mind, and I call the second the contemplative mind. See, we move out of that thinking mind and into that mind that allows for more openness, more possibility. That's what prayer is about. He says these are two entirely different types of software. And since the first one is almost totally and always in control and has become your operating hardware, you have to be carefully taught how to pray, which is exactly what the disciples asked of Jesus. Lord, teach us to pray. If you do not learn how to pray and change your mind by a spiritual revolution, you will try to process issues with utterly inadequate software. Utterly inadequate software. See, prayer is not about figuring out with a calculating mind what we need to have God do. Prayer is not about changing God. It's about widening our lens. It's about this, the work of emptying the mind and filling the heart. That's a switch. That's a hardware switch in the brain, or software switch in the brain. I guess the hardware is the same. We switch that software. And a friend of mine has a beautiful prayer that amplifies this. She says, bless them, change me. It's that simple. So switch software. That's the S. The K in ask stands for know that good is present and expect it. Jack Kornfield says, when stories of our life no longer bind us, we discover something greater. We discover something greater. That stories no longer bind us. You know, one thing we're learning in these times, especially in these times, is that we really can no longer rely on our news agencies for news, because really they're opinioned clubs. You know, one has this opinion and the other has that opinion, and then they bark at you. This is the opinion. This is the opinion you should have. But it's really not just news anymore. So we can't rely on it to be fact. So who can we rely on? What can we rely on then? Know that good is present. See, we rely on that awareness of the presence that we have deep within us. that presence that is goodness itself, always expressing, present in and through all of creation. The knowledge that everything is for us. Everything is for us. We have faith in this goodness of God, of the presence. Know that. Know that. This will help us be able to have an open mind. When we're so firmly rooted in that as our identity, that we are the presence expressing, that we are goodness, that the world is based in goodness and light and love. This allows us to open to other possibilities. So ask. ASK. A stands for ask the questions. Is it true? Is it really true? And then turn it around. The S, switch hardware. Go from the thinking mind, the calculating mind, to the contemplative mind, the heart. And the K, know that good is present and expect good. Expect good. See, we have to let go of what we think is going to happen and say, good news, bad news, who knows? We're not sure. We don't want to put much stock in the stories. And we want to know that the presence of God is always present, always goodness, and always, always on our side. So let's go into prayer treatment. As we breathe, we realize that that breath is so freely given. There is no judgment about who deserves the breath or doesn't. It is simply breath because there is love. This one essence, this one presence, this one vibratory consciousness is the essence of love and light itself. And it cannot be squashed. It cannot be lessened because there is nothing else out there to lessen it. It is all that there is. And that means that we are of that very substance, the light, the love, the goodness of God. And in that awareness, I speak my word that goodness prevails. Goodness prevails. That regardless of whether we are being sad or happy, regardless of whether we have thought that things are not good or that they are good, that what we can rely on is this one presence, fully active, fully present, fully evolving into even greater and greater good. And that we, as part of that, are also bearers of good to the world. So in this awareness, we open our minds. We open our minds to see as the presence sees, to see as the heart sees, to see at a higher level of consciousness, that when it's all said and done, all is well. All is well. In this awareness, I give thanks, knowing that, of course, this is the way it is. And so it is. Amen.